So Professor Moushumi Guha is from the philosophy department of Jadavpur University. Her main research area is philosophy of mind and cognitive science. She has many important publications to her credit. So I welcome Professor Guha to this, week-long course on Western philosophy organized by Bhaktivedanta Research Center. So without wasting any more time, may I request Professor Guha to make her presentation. Professor Guha, please.
Thank you so much. I am very grateful to the center and particularly to Professor Nirmalo Narayan Chakraborty, because this is a great opportunity for me as well to recall or recollect some of the things that we had learned during our master's courses and some of the things that we taught at the higher postgraduate degree courses in our university. And so in essence, what I'm going to present or what I'm going to talk about today is not in the form of a paper presentation, but more in the form of a, let's say, a facilitative lecture in which I hope the participants will also be able to throw some light. And I am not sure how far the issue of skepticism has already been covered in the previous lecture. And so please do forgive me if I am repeating to a very large extent, because as you see, we cannot always reconstruct the history of philosophy. And so whatever I have to say about skepticism and its connection to epistemology might have already been covered to some extent, at least in the previous lecture. So do please let me know if that is the case. However, I do encourage a lot of discussion if the organizers allow me. So I may, at some points of time during the middle of my lecture, I may actually stop and look for some small or big discussion with the participants. With that, let me start what I'm going to talk about. I had titled my lecture "From Doubt to Knowledge, Skepticism as a Precursor to Epistemology." So my initial interest, my initial contention, and my initial idea when I was thinking of the title was that there can be no epistemology without skepticism. And I'm sure that all of us here have already completed our post-graduation degrees, and some of you may also be engaged in higher research. Maybe some of you have already completed your PhDs. Whatever be the case, all of us have at some point of time come across this idea, whether in the study of Western philosophy or in the study of Indian philosophy, that there can be no knowledge without inquiry, no knowledge without inquisitiveness, no knowledge without a sense of gap, which we often call doubt. And in the context of Indian philosophy, when we were taught by the stalwarts like Professor Pradut Kumar Mukhopadhyay, Professor Ratna Datta Sharma, we all learned from them that sangshay is one of the necessary precursors to knowledge. With that notion in my head, I had thought that I will be able to build a concrete structure showing doubt at the foundation, building up into different forms of knowledge. But then later, when I started working on this lecture, when I started writing and taking down points for today's discussion with you all, I realized that it's not such an easy task. So in my very little capacity, I have still tried to show that skepticism is a precursor to epistemology, and we do essentially move from doubt to knowledge in any epistemological enterprise. My point of view in this lecture will be primarily Western epistemology. Though I am sure, I am also aware, I've heard from my seniors and experts in Indian philosophy that such is also the case. in Indian philosophy. So, where should we begin with today? We obviously need to begin with what skepticism is. And I'm sure that the previous speaker has already thrown light on that topic, but still, I have to do it in my own way. So, here are some thoughts that I'm going to share with you. So, what is skepticism? In very simple terms, skepticism is doubt. And to doubt is to arrest knowledge. To doubt is to question, right? So when I doubt whether I will receive my Amazon packet tomorrow or day after, I essentially say that I do not know whether or that the Amazon packet will arrive tomorrow. So there are two things that we note from this particular way in which I have stated the example, which obviously is a very simple day-to-day commonsensical example and not a philosophical one. But we do note from this that whenever we have or whenever we face doubt, we stall knowledge, we stall assertion. And so, skepticism, as we understand it within philosophy, has to do with propositional matters. Skepticism has to do with assertions and denials. So, skepticism, as we know it in philosophy, is a pretty linguistic thing, like other things in philosophy, even though we usually look upon it from a purely epistemological point of view. Skepticism, in its essence, has to do with propositions when we are speaking of it in a philosophical context, when we are speaking of it in a philosophically interesting context. So, when we say that skepticism is, in a very common or simple sense, nothing but doubt, we essentially mean that to doubt is to arrest the possibility of asserting something. Now, if we look at this purely from a grammatical or structural point of view, to arrest an assertion is to raise a question, isn't it? So, when we were kids, when we were learning English grammar, for example, we learned that sentences, when we were kids, we were not told about the difference between statements and sentences and propositions. So, we learned that sentences may be either inquisitive sentences or assertive sentences. And so when we are saying that doubt arrests assertion, it probably means that doubt encourages questions. Okay? So I have deliberately begun today's talk by referring to something that we have learned at a very, very early stage of our lives, language learning. And I wanted to show how this connects with even the highest of philosophical issues that we can deal with, which is skepticism. And we all know how important it is to epistemology and to philosophy in general. But see how we can talk about doubt or skepticism as a denial or a withholding of assertions. And so, in that sense, skepticism could be thought of as the raising of questions. And we all know, philosophically speaking, that the raising of questions has been regarded in the history of Western philosophy, in the history of Indian philosophy, as the essential precursor to knowledge, to the acquisition of knowledge. And in fact, we know that philosophers like Russell have upheld the very idea that philosophy itself is nothing but questioning. So, in one sense, we could think of philosophy itself as a skeptical enterprise. So, in one sense, on the one half, being skeptical, talking about skepticism, thinking about doubt is doing a propositional exercise, and on the other, it has to do with a particular doxastic state, the state of belief. So we could say that doubting or skepticism or skeptical attitude has to do with belief and the propositional content thereof. Okay, so doubting has to do with a state, namely the state of belief and its content, which we generally think of as propositional in nature. Now, belief is, as I said, a doxastic attitude. And doxastic attitudes are essentially or mainly of two kinds, belief and disbelief. But if some of you at least have read Chisholm's famous book, The Theory of Knowledge, you may recall that Chisholm talks not only about belief and disbelief, Chisholm also talks about the suspension of judgment with regard to believing or not believing something. Hence, among doxastic attitudes, we can consider not only belief, but also disbelief, and definitely suspension of judgment, which in other languages, in other expressions, we could term epoche. We could call this some form of agnosticism about propositions. In other words, suspension of judgment is a form of agnosticism about the truth of propositions. So we could neither say that they are true nor say that they are false. And that in turn is neither belief nor disbelief, but a third kind of doxastic state. Now, this has been greatly challenged by some epistemologists who would rather not have this as a third category, who would rather say that this is a kind of failure of either belief judgments or denial of belief, judgments about denial of belief. But the general belief, the general tendency is to think of three doxastic states: belief, disbelief, and suspension of belief. Okay, so at this point of time, I would really like to take a 2-minute break and get back to the participants and ask them if whatever I have said till now has made sense, number one, and if they have anything to tell me, if they have anything to add. If Nirmaloda, may I just stop for 2 minutes and talk to the participants? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, okay. Thank you. So participants, could you give me a little bit of feedback so that I know from my side that, my attempt to build upon this issue is making sense to you. And if you have some questions, please go ahead. If there's anybody who would, give me the feedback about how this is building up and whether you have already talked about this in the previous lectures, that is also something I would like to know, because that would help me decide what I'm going to talk about next. Have you already talked about this in any of the previous talks?
No, ma'am. Actually, there was a little part about skepticism, but explanation, I mean, total explanation was not given in that class. So I think we can go through.
Really, because this is a sort of lecture, and because we don't always get the opportunity to read materials on all the topics that we hear about, I also take this opportunity to read before you bits and pieces from various significant writings on these matters. Some of these writings I have also shared with our organizer, and maybe you will get hold of them at some point of time. So I'm just making sure that the literature also talks about these matters in the same way in which I have started today. So here goes. This is a quotation. These are not my words. Belief and disbelief are two of the so-called doxastic attitudes that we can adopt towards a proposition. We can also, of course, not even consider a proposition and thus not adopt any doxastic attitude towards it. But most philosophers would hold that in addition to belief and disbelief, there is a third possible doxastic attitude that we can adopt towards a proposition. Namely, we can suspend judgment or withhold assent with respect to it. Suspension of judgment is thus a bona fide doxastic attitude alongside belief and disbelief, and is not to be equated with the failure to adopt any doxastic attitude. Because it is a genuine doxastic attitude, suspension of judgment, just like belief and disbelief, and unlike the failure to form any doxastic attitude, can itself be justified or unjustified. This is important. If we take suspension of judgment as a third doxastic attitude, then being a doxastic attitude, it would be either justified or not justified. And here is an example which I have taken from the writing itself. Suspension of judgment with regard to the proposition, Paris is the capital of France, or Kolkata is the capital of West Bengal, is not justified. But with respect to a proposition like there are even number of stars in the Milky Way, suspension of judgment is justified, because it is really not possible for us to say at any given point of time how many stars countably there are in our own galaxy, leave alone the other galaxies or leave alone the universe as a whole. Because as we all know that stars are dynamic systems of dust and gas, and they are born and they die, and there is no way in which we can see them as and when they are born or as and when they die. So any counting of stars is in a very physicistic sense, in the sense of physics, not possible. So whether the number of stars is even or not is something we may suspend our judgments about, and we may be justified in doing so. And that is what makes this form of doxastic state, namely the suspension of judgment, a valid doxastic state. Now, why have I been harping upon these three doxastic states? Why is it important for me to say again and again or reiterate that suspension of judgment is a kind of doxastic state like belief and disbelief? We will know just now why it is important. Because we can now ask whether skepticism is about disbelief or suspension of belief. So when I said that skepticism in ordinary terms is doubt, and when I said that doubt is the suspension of assertion or assent, saying yes is suspended when we doubt, then is doubt a kind of disbelief, or is it a kind of suspension of belief? This is a very valid question. And we will see that this question has indeed been answered in the history of skepticism. Now, before I move on to give you the answer to this question, let me just go back to my first point, which was skepticism, very commonly speaking, is a kind of doubt. And there, when I was saying this, I had mentioned that what we are doing today is philosophical skepticism. Skepticism as it is relevant to or as it is interesting to the philosopher. And so obviously the very commonsensical or ordinary notion of that word may not be appealing enough to us. So we often distinguish between ordinary skepticism and philosophical skepticism. And I'm sure all of you know about this because this is usually talked about in a master's course. Now, in ordinary skepticism, for example, in the skepticism about whether a particular glass of water is contaminated or not, should I drink it, should I not? In that kind of a skepticism, it is expected that some answer is forthcoming. Okay. So we often talk about such ordinary commonsensical skepticism or ordinary doubt, as we call it, as local. It is local. And we can address it directly and we can probably find an answer to it. And so the people or person who raises that doubt doesn't expect never to find an answer. But philosophical skepticism tends to be general. It tends to, go out of hand. Once you start being a philosophical skeptic, you can't stop. It's like a slippery slope. And so when you keep doubting about the possibility of this and that knowledge, you realize that you are actually questioning the very possibility of knowledge in itself. So you're not questioning whether knowledge of X is possible or knowledge of Y is possible. You are actually questioning whether knowledge at all is possible. So that is also called global doubt. It's global. It is not confined to any particular content. It is doubt in general. And that is the nature of philosophical skepticism. Also, in philosophical skepticism, we expect not to find an answer if we are on the skeptic's side. So the philosophical skeptic tends to push us towards a total state of denial or suspension. And that is why philosophical skepticism is important and interesting to the philosopher who wishes to pursue epistemology. Because unless the philosophical skeptic is put to rest, unless the philosophical skeptic is silenced, the very exercise of doing a theory of knowledge cannot proceed. And so coming back to our question about whether skepticism tags on to disbelief or to suspension of belief, we should keep in mind that this kind of disbelief is not disbelief about this and that, but disbelief in general about the very possibility of knowledge. And this kind of suspension of belief is also similarly not local, but global. We suspend belief in everything. This, differentiation would take us to two different sorts of skepticism that have been around since the time of the ancient Greeks. And I'm sure that this kind of skepticism, this kind of dichotomy about the types of skepticism has been around in other cultural traditions too. At least if I recall my undergraduate classes with Professor Ratna Datta Sharma, I keep thinking of Bad Jolpu and Bitonda in the context of Nyay, ancient Nyay. And perhaps that is also one of the parallels to the notion of skepticism as we have identified it in the ancient Greek traditions. The Greek root of the word skepticism is in the word skepsis. Interestingly, this word means inquiry. And I think we would all agree once again that inquiry is the first step towards the acquisition of knowledge. And so my original project, my intention to connect skepticism with knowledge and epistemology seems to be a very straightforward and easy thing. Because if skepsis, the word from which skepticism has come, means inquiry, then inquiry is obviously the first step towards the acquisition of knowledge, and then inquiry is that which actually leads us into epistemology. So it could be the gate or the key to epistemology. But that is easier said than established. Because skepticism is, in fact, seen to be antithetical to knowledge. In fact, as I said, it is antithetical to belief. So that leaves us among the three doxastic states that we spoke about. If skepticism cancels belief, that leaves us with the two other doxastic states, that is disbelief and suspension of belief. And that is how we will arrive at two different forms of skepticism, at least in the ancient Greek context. And so in this sense, skepticism is the greatest impediment to established epistemology. Rather than being a gateway or key to epistemology, it turns out that skepticism is actually an impediment to epistemology. Ancient Greek skepticism illustrates clearly the way skepticism is antithetical to belief. That takes us to the historical roots of skepticism in Greece and the two main types of skepticism that arose from that intellectual soil. And once again, I'm quoting here from other people's writings. Ancient skepticism is as much concerned with belief as with knowledge. As long as knowledge has not been attained, the skeptics aim not to affirm anything. Imagine a world in which you do not speak, you do not utter, or you do not assert anything unless you are absolutely sure that you know. So that is why I hope it makes sense to you why I began by saying that it's also about language and language use. The skeptical attitude, therefore, sort of prevents us from making unsure assertions, which is something we always do on a day-to-day basis. This gives rise to the most controversial ambition, a life without belief. Ancient skepticism is, for the most part, a phenomenon of post-classical Hellenistic philosophy. The academic and Pyrrhonian skeptical movements begin roughly in the 3rd century BCE and end with Sextus Empiricus in the 2nd century CE. Hellenistic philosophy is a large-scale conversation, not unlike philosophy today. The skeptics, among them Pyrrho, Timon, Arcesilos, Carneades, Sextus Empiricus, do engage with pre-Socratic philosophy. Socrates, Protagoras, Plato, perhaps even Aristotle. But we have to remember, from the historical point of view, they are contemporary to the Greek Epicureans, the Stoics, the Cynics, and the Logicians. So historically speaking, ancient Greek skepticism is more about an attack on belief and an attack on assertions. So you see how ancient Greek skepticism could be construed as a very anti-Davidsonian thing as well. If we think of Davidson's tripod of language, thought, and action. Perhaps ancient Greek skepticism represents a direct axing of these three tripods and a collapse of the corresponding knowledge system. Because unless they are saying, the ancient Greek skeptics say that unless you are sure, you do not assert, you do not believe, and you do not act. And we will see later on, I'll just mention in passing that therefore ancient Greek skepticism had a great impact on ethics as well. So we just heard that ancient Greek skepticism builds upon two doxastic states, disbelief and suspension of belief. And these two represent two kinds of ancient Greek skepticism, namely the academic skepticism and the Pyrrhonian skepticism. So let's move on to that now, academic and Pyrrhonian skepticism. Do you have any questions at this point of time, or should I proceed?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So, you know, the word skepsis, which is the source of the word skepticism, is actually the opposite of the antonym of dogmata, the Greek word dogmata, from which the word dogma has come. So dogmata or dogma is a strong belief or conviction about aspects of reality or about reality itself. So when we hold on to a dogma, we assert with conviction. And when we have skepsis, we do just the opposite. So you see, skepsis and dogmata are opposed to each other. Now, if we recall the definition or analysis of knowledge, I hope you all remember that this refers to JTB. So remember the definition or analysis of knowledge. This is an attack on the belief component. Okay. Ancient Greek skepticism was thus antithetical to belief and thereby to knowledge itself. This opposition to belief came in two ways, in the form of academic skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism. Here again, I'm going to read out from the literature, and I have deliberately selected those chunks of literature which are easy to understand when you hear them. You won't be surprised to learn that what these terms mean is a matter of some controversy among scholars, that is academic skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism. Some bits, however, have achieved general agreement. Pyrrhonian and academic skepticism mark two branches of ancient skepticism. David Hume and other modern philosophers also used those terms. One way to discriminate them is institutionally. So now, one way to differentiate between academic skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism is to think of their intellectual sources. You know, it's like saying that academic skepticism is the child of such and such school of philosophy, and Pyrrhonian skepticism is the child of some other school of philosophy. You know that Plato started the academy, but after Plato's death, there were other leaders or principals or whatever they called these, the main driving forces behind the academy. Academic skepticism historically arose in the academy after Plato. So academic skepticism after Plato's death, the academy was dominated by skeptical thinkers. The philosophical work engaged by those thinkers came to be called academic skepticism. The major texts by which academic skepticism came to be known to the modern world were not written by those who were at that point of time in the academy, but rather by Cicero, Roman philosopher. His books, Academica and De Natura, became highly influential texts of academic skepticism. Pyrrhonian skepticism, by contrast, follows a line rooted in the thought of a man named Pyrrho, who lived in a small town of Elis on the other side of Greece. Pyrrho was not associated with any academic institution of any prominence. And he seems to have written nothing. This is very significant. His follower Timon, however, did make it to Athens and wrote a book called Siloi or Lampoons. Centuries later, Pyrrhonian skepticism became associated with the work of Sextus Empiricus. So let me say in passing that from a purely examination point of view, it might be interesting to remember two of the most significant representatives of academic and Pyrrhonian skepticism, namely Cicero and Sextus Empiricus. His book, Outlines of Pyrrhonism, was the single most important conduit of Pyrrhonian ideas into today's philosophical world. And it's probably the ideas in which we are more interested. In general, Pyrrhonian skepticism is taken to be more radical than academic skepticism. Pyrrhonism is associated with ideas like the suspension of all belief, a rejection of all knowledge claims, and all criteria for distinguishing truth from falsehood. Academic skepticism is associated instead with the abandonment of absolute certainty and definite knowledge. In particular, the rejection of the Stoics' ideas about indubitable perceptions. But academics are held to accept a more moderate position of probabilistic belief and probabilistic criteria. By this is meant that academic skepticism is thought to reject claims to definitely know X, but not the idea that some beliefs about X are more probably true than others. So, academics were more willing to construct philosophical theories and to engage in philosophical debates with other schools. But Pyrrhonians, for fear of becoming dogmatic, developed very little philosophical theory, and they constantly demonstrated that philosophical dogma in any form has to be resisted. Yet, even the Pyrrhonians embraced what we call a common life. And that common life had a fourfold characteristic, So even though Pyrrhonians suspended all belief and all judgment and all assertions, etc., yet they had to survive. And for that survival, they did what was absolutely essential for survival. And there are four things that are covered in living life, so to say. What are those four things? The practical technologies of life, nature, the compulsion of our feelings, and the customary practices of the societies in which they find themselves. This sounds pretty Humean to me. But anyway, let's not get into that at this point of time. What I can say to you is that the main difference between academic skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism, therefore, hinges upon the distinction between two doxastic states, the states of disbelief and suspension of belief. The Pyrrhonians talk about suspension of belief because disbelief itself could be construed as a negative assertion of some belief. So to say that P is not true, P is not justified, P is not to be believed in, is also to say something about P. And that too is an assertion for a Pyrrhonian. So these are the central or key points with regard to the three doxastic states and how ancient skepticism of the Greek variety aligns with the two main negative doxastic states and gives rise to two, we could say, schools of skepticism, namely academic skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism. And I'm sure that all of this you have already learned at some point of time or the other. All I'm doing is helping you all recall those lessons and probably connecting them into a coherent picture. So we are already a little bit into the history of skepticism. Like every other topic in philosophy, skepticism also has a history. And we just talked about the ancient history of it in the Greek world. This is definitely with reference to Western philosophy. And so we may rightfully inquire about the position of skepticism during the medieval period in Western philosophy. Why this is interesting, I won't say this is important, but this is interesting. Because see, usually when we talk about the history of medieval Western philosophy, we think of it as a system of dogmatisms, confident assertions, and most of them were greatly religious in nature as well. And we know that Christianity at that point of time was having a lot of impact on Western philosophy, and to question, to hold the doxastic states of disbelief and suspension of belief could not have been taken in the right way, right? So we might think that the medieval history of skepticism is lost. We might think that the medieval history of skepticism is not there at all. And so, once again, I fall back upon another document and read a little bit for you. Overarching surveys of the history of philosophy often leave the impression that philosophical skepticism had many adherents in the ancient and Hellenistic periods, but disappeared completely as a topic of intellectual interest during the Middle Ages and returned as a viable position during the Renaissance and the early modern periods. As a survey, this is quite understandable, since no thinker from the Middle Ages professed an active allegiance to systematic philosophical skepticism. But a closer examination of medieval philosophy shows that despite skepticism's disappearance as an overt philosophical movement, it continued to swirl in the thoughts of many of the best philosophers of that period. Who are the best philosophers of the medieval period? The first name that occurs to us is Saint Augustine, Al-Ghazali. They claimed to have been systematic skeptics at some point in their pasts before they became who they were. And many others held skeptical views about localized issues, such as one's ability to know an efficient cause, and even more discussed and attempted to refute commonplace skeptical arguments in defense of their own anti-skeptical positions. So, during the medieval period, skepticism did raise its head, mostly in the form of an antithesis. Mostly, the philosophers wanted to override skepticism so as to establish some very strict dogmatic positions. chronologically speaking, skeptical issues were most prominently considered in works from both the leading and tail ends of the Middle Ages. Augustine's 4th and 5th century attacks against academic skeptics marked the beginning of such discussions. You know, as we say in Indian philosophy, the opinion of the other is important when we are refuting that opinion to establish our own. The same must have been true for the philosophers of the Middle Ages, because they had to essentially refute the skeptics in order to establish their own dogmas. And here are some of the important figures who were indeed quite influential in the epistemological circuit. Some of these names all of us have heard: Henry of Ghent, Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, Peter Oriol, and others. Though medieval discussions of skepticism are often found buried within larger formulaic discussions of theological topics, those treatments had influence beyond the academic circles within which they were originally created. So among the early modern philosophers, Descartes in particular owes a debt to these earlier accounts of skepticism. Versions of both his cogito and evil demon arguments may be found in the works of medieval philosophers. So if you go back to your reading of most of the important books of history of Western philosophy, let's say, for example, Copleston. Even in case of Descartes, I find Falkenberg's account very, very important. If you go back to those history of Western philosophy texts, you will find that Descartes was highly influenced by the scholastics. His early education was in scholasticism, in a scholastic milieu. And we know that scholasticism is the tie, is the connecting point between medieval and modern philosophy. And so we find in Descartes reflections of the kinds of skepticism that were extant during the medieval period. So it would not be right to say that medieval theology or medieval religious philosophy completely overlooked skepticism. The ancient and medieval roots of skepticism often translated into metaphysical and ethical matters. As I said in passing earlier, this is a very significant observation for those who are interested in skepticism in general, that skepticism of the ancient and medieval kinds found expression in metaphysical claims, in denials of various metaphysical entities, and also found expression in ethical matters and involved a certain view of life, a certain way of living, leading the skeptics to appear as wise persons. So, skeptics of the ancient period in particular were looked upon with a lot of reverence because they had an appearance of being wise. In metaphysical terms, such skepticism meant that whether truth could be achieved and asserted, and belief in propositions could be reinstated, we could live life in a state of suspended belief and accept truth-like constructs to conduct our day-to-day affairs. This is very, very important. I'm going to draw your attention once again to this particular point, that even though the academic skeptics as well as the Pyrrhonians talked about either disbelief or suspension of belief as the two important doxastic states to hold in philosophy, they still conducted their day-to-day affairs. In order to conduct day-to-day affairs, even in a state of suspension of belief, or in a state of disbelief might appear to us as a very difficult thing to do, right? If I cannot convince myself about anything in any significant way, if I cannot assert anything significantly in any significant way, how do I even go to a shopkeeper and ask for half a kg of rice? Because that too would raise the question, what is half a kg of rice? What if one small grain of rice makes the difference? So you see, being skeptical appears to be a difficult moral stance, a difficult practical stance. And in fact, most of the later philosophers who have refuted skepticism have refuted it from a practical or pragmatic point of view. Because logically speaking, skepticism is a very strong philosophical position and it's not easy to refute. But see, these skeptics, they went on with their day-to-day lives, even having suspended belief, even having encouraged or disbelieved matters that other philosophers considered to be true. How did they do that? We did hear, I read out a little portion from one of the writings, and we did read from there that these skeptics nonetheless talked about truth-like things, things that may not be true, things that may not be asserted as being absolute, but are nonetheless truth-like. This is very important from the point of view of, say, philosophy of science. In philosophy of science, this finds reflection in the distinction between truth and verisimilitude, and is essentially the root to metaphysical and scientific anti-realism. So the anti-realists also do science. They talk about good and bad scientific theories, but they do it not from within any notion of truth or satisfaction, but they do so from the point of view of verisimilitude, something that is fact-like, something that is truth-like, as if something that emulates truth, truthকে নকল করে, কিন্তু ট্রু কিনা বলা যাবে না। Okay, sorry for that little bit of Bengali, but sometimes it's easier to explain these things. So you can see now what I meant by saying that skepticism not only has an impact on epistemology, but has a very deep impact on metaphysics and philosophy of science and contemporary discussions on realism and anti-realism. In contemporary epistemology, skepticism, however, is not essentially limited to the belief part of knowledge. So till now, we have been talking about skepticism as something that latches on to the B and T part of JTB, truth and belief portion, and centrally the belief portion, because we were talking about doxastic states. But you know, when we come to the contemporary, or let's say the modern world, post-Descartes, we think of skepticism in slightly different ways. We think of skepticism now as an impediment towards epistemology, of course, as an impediment towards epistemology because it is an impediment to knowledge, which is the pillar of epistemology, but also directly antithetical to epistemology itself. What does this mean? See, in the ancient and medieval times, particularly in the ancient times, skepticism barred the possibility of knowledge by questioning the very notion of belief and truth. But in the contemporary world, skepticism debars, skepticism impedes any discussion of knowledge, any attempt to have a theory of knowledge in itself. Mane epistemology. Theory of knowledge is epistemology. How? Because in the contemporary world, skepticism tags with the justification part of knowledge. So, J of the JTB. And if justification is weakened, is questioned, then no theory of knowledge is possible anymore. Theorizing about knowledge becomes very, very difficult, if not impossible. And so epistemology as a structure becomes absolutely difficult. Hence, in contemporary epistemology, skepticism is directly connected with the issue of justification through via the epistemic circularity issue. This is another very important topic in any graduate study of epistemology, postgraduate study of epistemology. That is the notion of epistemic circularity. Another name for it, or another way of expressing epistemic circularity, is to talk about epistemic regress. You know, this famous epistemic regress problem in epistemology, which essentially has to do with justification. Now, what is this epistemic circularity? Let me explain in brief what epistemic circularity or regress is. Again, I'm quoting here from one of my favorite authors, Ernest Sosa. And this is actually a joint publication of Ernest Sosa and Barry Stroud. Epistemic circularity has dogged epistemology from the time of the Greek skeptics through Descartes' circle and Hegel's serpent biting its tail, to serve finally as a source of today's relativism and skepticism. An important source, though, of course, only one of the several. Since there is no way to justify one's overall practical and theoretical stance without circularity, we are told, all justification must be ultimately relative to one's basic commitments, conceived perhaps as arbitrary creatures of the will. In comparing overall systems, anyhow, especially when these are equally coherent and self-supportive, there is no way to privilege one's own except arbitrarily, irrationally, or irrationally, perhaps by adopting a frank and honest ethnocentrism. That is today a widespread attitude. What is this about? Let me explain. In the contemporary world, we think that the epistemic status of a proposition somehow depends upon the epistemic status of other propositions with which it holds entailment relations, or say some sort of logical relations. So if P is a proposition, its epistemic status would depend on QRS, say, with which P is connected, logically connected. And then if anybody asked about the epistemic status of, say, Q or R, one could say that it depends further upon S and T. And so if we asked further how the epistemic status of S or T is to be determined, we could come back and say, well, because P. And remember, that is where we started. So our initial question was, how to determine the epistemic status of P. And we started by answering that, well, it depends on the epistemic status of Q and R, which are also propositions which connect with P. And then the epistemic status of Q and R can be determined by with reference to the epistemic status of S and T. And then, at some point of time, come back in a circle, as, biting the serpent's tail. Even cats do that a lot, they bite their own tail. So it's a circle. We call this the problem of circularity. We call this in many names in both Indian and Western philosophy, but nonetheless, it is taken to be a problem, which essentially boils down to saying that there is no way to establish epistemic justification at all, because there is no beginning and no end. The same could be given the form of a regress, an infinite regress. If we could think of a certain branch of justification moving on and on and on in a linear way, instead of coming back in a circle, we could think of it as a linear infinite regress with no starting point. So if we limit ourselves to propositions, and if we say that the epistemic status of one proposition essentially and only depends upon the epistemic status of other propositions, then we are confined to a world of propositions. And we have nothing beyond this world of propositions to go by. So in the contemporary arena, in philosophy, in epistemology, skepticism takes a new form. It is no longer a question of mere suspension of belief. It is a question of arriving at a plausible justification for some belief or some disbelief or some suspension of belief. So you see, it rises above the merely doxastic level. In the contemporary world, skepticism is not merely doxastic. Skepticism is justificatory. And so the very enterprise of epistemology is sort of threatened. And so my original intention to show that skepticism is somehow a friend of epistemology, skepticism is something that helps to build epistemology from scratch, seems to be not so easy to establish anymore. What is the possible outcome of this? What is the possible way to come out of this? That is when we enter into a discussion of a very significant distinction in philosophy between causation and justification. This is a very old distinction, we find references to it in contemporary works like Ryle's concept of mind as well, where he distinguishes between a reason and a cause. And then there are others who actually conflate the two. They say that they are actually the same thing. Then we have a huge problem. And it takes us down the route towards coherentism. Whatever be the case, whatever epistemological choices we make with regard to justification, this distinction is very important, the distinction between causation and justification. When we say that there is epistemic circularity or epistemic regress, whichever one we prefer more, we essentially mean to say that justification is different from causation, and that justification is primarily a linguistic or intellectual matter. It is a matter built from beliefs rather than a matter built from concrete things out there in the world. So even if a stone hits you on your temple and you believe that the world is moving or spinning rapidly, this belief of yours may have been caused by the stone hitting your temple, but it does not justify your belief. The fact of the stone hitting your temple is the cause of your belief, but it is not a justification of your belief. So this distinction between causation and justification plays a very significant role in contemporary discussions on skepticism and epistemology. I am sure that most of you here would know that this distinction between causation and justification also leads to different theories of justification, different theories of the structure of justification as well as the source of justification. Let me explain this a little bit, though I'm sure that this is all known to you, but still it would help establish some sort of a well-rounded structure. So when we distinguish between causation and justification with regard to epistemological issues, we talk about different binaries in theory of knowledge, in epistemology. For example, in terms of the structure of justification, we say that there are foundationalist theories of justification and there are coherentist theories of justification. In the former, that is, in the foundationalist theories of justification, causation is also taken to be a kind of justification. So if my proposition latches on to some aspect of reality and derives its truth from it, its justification could also be thought of in some way, in some twisted way, to be derived from how it has been caused. On the contrary, if I would rather not move out of the language belief structure, if I would rather restrict my notion of justification to propositions, then I can never extend my hand beyond this matrix, so to say, this matrix of propositions, and reach out to the real world if there is any. In fact, I would have to suspend my final beliefs about the justificatory and causal roots of my beliefs outside of the belief system. Even though it would not sound very pleasant to say that coherentism encourages skepticism, or maybe vice versa, skepticism encourages coherentism about justification, it may in some sense be connected. These two things may in some sense be connected. But that doesn't mean that we take the leap of faith. Foundationalism, as the name itself suggests, involves some kind of a leap of faith beyond what we can talk about. And so it has led many philosophers to talk about the sources of justification in things that are taken to be true, unquestionably, things that are axiomatic in nature, things that are self-evident. And that definitely is very anti-skeptical. That definitely is a leap of faith and an assertion, perhaps beyond justification, as many of us would want to see it. So if I come towards the end of my lecture today, there is only one more important one more important part that I am yet to plug in. into this picture that I have been trying to draw before you, leading from skepticism to epistemology. And in this very historical journey that I have tried to take you through, that particular knob or part is the internalism externalism one. In epistemology, in the epistemology of justification, in the theory of justification, internalism and externalism also play a very, very important role and can be seen to be direct cousins or maybe nephews and nieces of skepticism. Though we, yes, is anyone saying anything?
No, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So even though it would be difficult for me to cover internalism and externalism in such a short while, very, very broadly speaking, very, very, intuitively speaking, internalism in epistemology tends to restrict justification within doxastic states. Even though, let me warn you here, even though there are foundationalists who are internalists. In fact, that's a very common position in epistemology. We have Lawrence Bonjour, we have Chisholm, who are both foundationalists and internalists. Yet, internalism in epistemology, very briefly speaking, would be the position in which the source of justification, justification er utshota lies within the boundaries of the mind brain. Okay, essentially propositional, linguistic, doxastic. Whereas in externalism, we would always find that eagerness to reach out of the matrix, so to say. I have just watched Matrix all over again, so I keep referring back to that movie. In externalism, there is this attempt to move out of this boundary and look for sources of justification in the causal realm, even though there could be, philosophically speaking, coherentist externalists. So what I leave you to explore for your own today is this very Kantian combinatorial possibility. Like, when we read Kant at the postgraduate level, we talk about analytic synthetic, a priori, a posteriori, we connect analytic with a priori, synthetic with a posteriori, and then say, is synthetic a priori judgment possible? Something like that, combinations. Similarly, what I leave you all today to do for your own is to try and connect causation justification, this binary, with foundationalism, coherentism on the one hand, and internalism, externalism on the other. And you will find that logically, as well as historically, there are different permutations. There are different possible permutations of these positions. And all of these can be traced back to some form of skepticism or the other, or to some form of attempt to override skepticism, nonetheless skepticism. So let me, maybe perhaps a little overconfidently end today's discussion from my side by saying that skeptics, the Chisholm saw rightly that the skeptic's challenge is central to epistemology. And so even a person of his stature, a person of Chisholm's stature in epistemology is like God. Even a person of his stature begins his seminal book by talking about the skeptic's challenge and how to respond to that challenge, and by admitting that logically it is almost impossible to satisfactorily respond to the skeptic's challenge. And from there, there is another road that takes us towards logic and philosophy of science. See, we were talking about epistemology, but there is also a direct route from skepticism to logic and philosophy of science, where we explore ideas like inference to the best explanation. And so with that, I come to an end of what I had to talk about today, and I would really welcome your questions and comments. Thank you. Nirmaloda, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Guho, for presenting us partly historical, partly conceptual issues concerning uh, skepticism and its role, its influence, the way it helps raising many philosophical issues. So thank you very much. So now we have almost 15 minutes in our hand. So I would like to ask participants, if you have any questions or comments or clarifications to make, please come forward.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yes, please.
Yes, ma'am, I want to know the outcome of your lecture from the point of view of philosophy of truth. So, in this way, if we are supporting coherentism, can we say that in the philosophy of truth, that the correspondence theory of truth, where we are seeking truth in the external world, is in one way overruled? That only in the coherence, in the coherent set of if we want to seek truth, we can only find the truth in the coherent set of propositions about any knowledge system, not in the external world.
Okay, so Tavoto, I'll answer. I don't know if I can answer this question, but I will tell you very honestly that inside me, philosophically speaking, there are two contradictory persons. One wants to think of truth as well as justification as foundationalist, but that philosophically is very difficult to establish. And so, philosophically, from a logical requirement, let's say, I think of coherentism in both cases, coherentism with truth as justification, as logically stronger options. So, I am not actually holding any particular position here. I'm just saying that from a purely commonsensical point of view, I would rather have some form of foundationalist theory of truth and justification. But from a philosophical or logical point of view, I see certain weaknesses therein, and I identify the strengths of an apparently weaker alternative, namely a coherentist view of life. Okay, so in effect, I haven't answered you because I think it's very difficult to answer you. I don't know how to bring these two together, though attempts have been made in the history of philosophy.
Ma'am, another query of mine is, in another way, isn't it affecting the natural sciences tremendously? I mean, the observation-based sciences.
See, from the philosophical point of view, in philosophy of science, there are both realists and anti-realists, okay?
Yes.
At the level of practice, it doesn't have much direct impact maybe, but both practitioners of science and philosophers of science realize at some point of time when they are into higher research that observations in science are not like observations of our day-to-day lives. Okay.
Yes.
For example, what is it to observe a quark?
Yes.
For example. Okay. So philosophical uncertainty and unsurety and nervousness mingles with scientific uncertainty and nervousness as well at the higher levels of research.
Yes.
So this brings us to the thing that I have already pointed out in my lecture with regard to a kind of distinction between ordinary life and the life of a philosopher or skeptic. You know, even
Yes.
the skeptic realizes that in order to survive, there are certain things I have to do.
Yes.
So they talk about verisimilitude. So maybe I don't know what truth is, but I know what it is to be like truth. Okay.
Okay.
So even in the folds of science, whether from the side of practice or from the side of philosophy, that is theory, there is this notion of verisimilitude. Yeah.
Okay.
This is a very, very strong notion.
Yes. Yes.
And this is actually connected with the problem of induction.
Okay.
Okay. We all know that the conclusion of an inductive argument, in whichever form you conceive induction, can never be certain. So in
Yes.
that sense, anyway, we have admitted that science never gives us certain knowledge, however much Kant tried to convince us.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any
You're
other question or comment or clarification?
Uh, Hello, ma'am. I just
Yes.
wanted to thank you. I'm new to this field, and your lecture was really great. Initially, I had difficulty following, but like by the end of it, I could understand it and follow it. And thanks for sharing those amazing materials. It is really nice, and I'm looking forward to get back to it, and read more about it. So thank you so much for it.
Thank you so much for that feedback.
Any other queries or clarifications?
Thank you, ma'am. Sir, may I ask something?
Yes, please go ahead.
Ma'am, my query is you talked about Vad Jalpa. It is quite similar. Can you clarify it a little more?
Okay. Though I'm not an expert in this field, but very briefly speaking, you know, when we talk about Vad, we say that the main intention of um the contending parties is to derive knowledge. Okay. So being skeptical or holding a skeptical attitude or suspension of belief or even disbelief is not the main intention behind Vad. Okay. Rather, on the contrary, the doxastic state of belief assumes highest significance in the context of Vad. So, you know, I talked about three doxastic states: belief, disbelief, and suspension of belief. And I said that skepticism is essentially either about disbelief or about suspension of belief. But Vad is about belief. It is with the intention of arriving at a state of belief about something. Okay. Now, Jolpo is more about you know, discussing with an intent to suspend belief without an intent to arrive at any categorical conclusion. Whereas in Vitonda, effectively there is only one position and the other party is constantly trying to axe that position. So effectively, it is the ideal skepticism in terms of Indian philosophy, to me at least, to my very little limited knowledge. I haven't studied Indian philosophy much beyond what I have been taught during my courses. Okay, so that is why I thought that it might be nice to think of a parallel in terms of the doxastic states.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the clarification. It's a nice talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments or clarifications? Well, if we don't have any other question, let me conclude this session by extending my sincere thanks to Professor Guha. This morning we could listen to two lectures on skepticism, and we could see that many very important issues in philosophy, in epistemology especially, how they have occupied a prominent place in history of epistemology, right from the Greek period. And till today, a lot of philosophers are trying to address this issue of skepticism, which really, uh, yielded so many interesting theories and debates and examples in epistemology. So, thank you, Professor Guha, for spending your time with us this morning. And so, with this, we end our morning session here. We have two more speakers in the post-lunch session. So please join us again at 2:30, and we are looking forward to those lectures as well. So see you at 2:30.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to the participants as well.